So we're just going to give it just a few more sort of minutes just to make sure everyone is in the room. I can see the numbers are rising. So whilst we do that, so we'll just do some introductions of ourselves. So I'm Mabel Edge, and I'm a child inclusive family mediator, and I conduct a lot of family mediation, and specifically a lot of child inclusive work. And pass over to you, Kathy.
I'm Kathy Francis from Stratford Family Mediation. I do a lot of child inclusive mediation. Obviously, that's why Mabel and I are here. I also do quite a bit of integrated mediation, and I'm a professional practice consultant. I think that's probably introduced me.
Yeah. Thanks, Kathy. So I can see the numbers are still sort of climbing, which is great. So there are over 100 and sort of 110 people here, 113 people here now. So I think, yeah, so I think if everyone's happy, we'll get underway. So thanks very much for everyone joining us this afternoon, really, to hear a little bit more about child inclusive mediation, and to sort of share and Kathy and I's experience about child inclusive mediation. So I'm just going to share the screen. Hopefully everyone will be able to see that now. So so the focus of today's session will be on understanding the purpose, the process, and valuing listening to children and young people. So so why child inclusive mediation matters. So I think sort of like, you know, before we kind of come onto the slide, really, and I think Kathy will resonate this, is that the increased push towards non-court dispute resolution and the focus over the last 10 or so years on families really trying to resolve matters between themselves outside of the court arena has kind of meant that at times the sort of voice of the child may end up being lost in those processes, so that children haven't necessarily had the opportunity to have their voice heard. So previously, when many cases were going through the court process, as many still do, there might be the involvement of a CAFCAS officer who might ascertain the views, wishes and feelings of a child or young person as part of those proceedings, and then input their views, as well as kind of formulating a judgment as to what the court's order should look like. So the real push really towards families taking responsibility and resolving matters between themselves outside of court has meant we've had to sort of really develop mechanisms and ways in which we ensure that the voice of the child is and continues to be heard in family decision making, so that, you know, their voice is central to the decisions that are being made about them. So that's really important. It's critical, really, in the work that we do to ensure that that parents kind of understand things from their child's perspective. So within the sort of family mediation arena, we often meet parents who are sort of focused on, you know, what I want and what I want, but actually it's not necessarily about what each parent wants. It's much more about focusing the parents on what the child needs, and giving the child a voice within that process really enables us to do that, and enables the child really to their child's voice to really impact the parents' thoughts in terms of the next steps and their decision making. And that ultimately means that the parents then are able to sort of prioritize the emotional and psychological well-being for their children, rather than sort of, you know, I want 50-50, or I want this night, or chopping nights, one night here, one night there, as sometimes we see in our work. So, you know, children's time isn't divided on a sort of percentage basis or on the basis of a spreadsheet. It's actually about putting their needs at the center, and child inclusive mediation really helps us to do that, and helps parents to hear what young people are thinking and feeling. Did you want to add anything, Kathy?
No, I think that's really summed it up well. Thank you.
Thank you. So looking at sort of the steps in the child inclusive mediation process, this sort of simplified sort of diagram that we've got here, but sort of just important to say for those of you listening in, is that the first step actually in the child inclusive mediation process is for both parents to attend the MIAM meeting, so that mediation information assessment meeting. So that's compulsory if we're going to look at any child inclusive mediation. But again, before we could consider consulting with the child as part of the process, the parents would have to attend a joint session. And by a joint session, that doesn't mean to say that they would necessarily be in the same room, but it means that they would be attending a joint session that takes place at the same time. So for example, in a shuttle mediation where parents perhaps might be in separate rooms, but at the same time, the mediator is going between the rooms. So that first joint session has to take place first before the mediator considers consulting with the child. And part of that work is about our preparation with the parents and making sure that parents understand the expectations that we have in terms of their remit, not to coach or guide the child towards any particular agenda, and also importantly to make sure that they can make use of the voice of the child. So, you know, how will it be if the child says that they don't want to do something, or they're not comfortable with something that might be being suggested, and what's the likely response from the parent in those scenarios? So for us, a bit of testing the water really to see what the reactions and responses of a parent might be. And then and only then, if we get to a point where we feel comfortable and that parents could make sensible use of child inclusive mediation, we would consider consulting with the child. Kathy, do you want to come in here?
Yes, I think it's to emphasize the importance of the mediation meeting with the parents, because sometimes the feedback from the children, and as a mediator you never know quite what the children are going to say. You could sometimes have an idea, but particularly if they're going to say something one parent doesn't want to hear, and if it's something quite upsetting, like they don't want any contact with that parent, you have to make sure that the parents are prepared to hear and listen to what the child says. There's still the adults making the decisions, but that they're going to at least acknowledge and take on board what their children say, because there's a risk of almost making it worse if the child gives their opinion and it's completely ignored and dismissed. And so that's the point where you really have to assess if it's going to be helpful.
Absolutely. It's such a careful and sensitive piece of work, that one, Kathy, isn't it? And I think it's true to say is that to be able to conduct child inclusive mediation, mediators have to go on to do some additional training. So we have to attend additional training to conduct child inclusive mediation. So only specialist mediators can conduct that work. But that doesn't mean to say that mediators who aren't SIM trained can offer child inclusive mediation, because the child inclusive mediation can still be offered as long as a child inclusive mediator such as myself or Kathy is able to then support that process by doing the pre-mediation discussions with the parents, and then making those arrangements if we feel comfortable to then go on to meet with the children as part of the process. And then we, as a child inclusive mediator, would then feed back anything that the child has asked us to share. So it's really important, and we'll hopefully cover it as we go, but that actually children have a right to choose whether they participate in this process. It's voluntary for them. So when we approach the child and we actually invite them to take the opportunity to meet with us, to share their thoughts and feelings, they can decline that, and that's absolutely fine. We've just created a brochure within our service that we send to children and young people, which is really supporting them to sort of help them to make the decisions. But ultimately, the meetings are confidential that we have between the child and the mediator. And as part of that, you know, the meeting can take between sort of 30 minutes and an hour, sometimes a bit longer, depending on the age of the child and how much they've got to say. Sometimes I have to close it down, which is very difficult. But actually it's about giving them that space, and sometimes this is the first opportunity they've ever had to really talk about these difficult things that have been happening in their lives, and to really share with someone who's, you know, got the time to listen to things from their perspective. And then for us to be able to respect the child's right to choose what they want to share, with the caveat around safeguarding, of course, but save for any safeguarding concerns, the young person does get to choose what we share and what we don't. Feedback to parents. Feedback is always verbal. It's really important to note that there is never any written feedback that comes out of a child-inclusive mediations, and that includes any summary letter from any subsequent mediations. We would never refer at any point in the future to the child's views in any written format. So sometimes there's a misunderstanding or some miscommunications, that people have expectations that we would provide them with something in writing that says, you know, Johnny felt this or Johnny felt that, but actually that's not felt to be helpful within the process, and sort of under our code of practice that we have to work within, it means that we certainly don't do that, and under any circumstances, irrespective of what the issues are, unless it's safeguarding concerns. So yeah, it's a really sort of supportive process, and I was fortunate enough to meet 2 young people this morning in a school, and then I had a long chat with the head teacher afterwards. Tried to sort of encourage her to come along this afternoon and find out a bit more, but actually that sort of opportunity for them to experience and to share their experiences of their family life with us, hopefully will be invaluable to them, but also invaluable to their parents in the feedback session on Thursday, when they then look to move on to talking about, you know, the time that the children will spend with each of them, for example, in that situation. Do you want to...
I think it's important not to just make assumptions, and for that opportunity to be offered to all children. I'm seeing a 24-year-old tomorrow, autistic girl, and her parents said, oh no, she won't want to speak. She doesn't like talking to anybody. But they asked her last night, and apparently she does want to come and have a say. And it's quite surprising. And younger children will come with older siblings, and children that are sort of maybe in their early 20s quite often want to have a say. And quite often it's something like, well, we're planning on leaving home in 6 months, so they don't need to worry about us. And it changes the dynamic of the discussions. But I think it's not to make any assumptions about who would or wouldn't want to have that opportunity. Sometimes they just feel respected because their parents have even considered asking them.
I think that's really important, and just picking up on the age thing there as well, Kathy, isn't it? Is that so? One of the children I saw this morning was 7, and the other one was 10. And really for us, I think sort of on reflection, you know, parents know their children well. You know, it's for them. They know how resilient they are. They know whether or not there's a likelihood of them sort of wanting to speak and wanting to share. And both children chose to be there, but I'd say on reflection that the 7-year-old probably wasn't old enough to participate today, but I guess that's just in terms of the level of maturity of where she's at, really. But actually I think that it's important not for us also not to have like expectations of you know, parents are thinking you know, their child is going to sort of come out and have a view about where they want to live and which parent they want to spend time with, but actually for a 7-year-old, that's not really the top of their agenda. Actually, she is really much more focused on, you know, where her teddy bears are going to be and those sorts of things. But actually that will be hopefully so rather than thinking, okay, well, you know, where do you want to spend your time, she's like, well, I just want to talk about my teddy bears, and that's what's important to her, but not to have like, we don't go in with any sort of set preconceived ideas or agenda that we're looking for people to respond to, or children to respond to. But I think sort of like you know, when we talk about child inclusive mediation, there's always sort of this sense of, you know, it's for children 10 and over, but I think that that's the sort of, you know, what we know in the UK to be, you know, the kind of age of responsibility, and where we sort of see, you know, children as being sort of competent to be able to sort of be involved and they have a right to, enshrined in English law, they have that right at the age of 10, but it doesn't mean to say that we shouldn't offer it to younger children as well, and to give them that opportunity as well. And I like what you said, Kathy, about the sort of potential for the siblings as well. coming with an older sibling perhaps as well, and that's sort of supportive. It has some potential pitfalls as well, of course, where they might be influenced by a sibling. But so let's move on then. So sort of thinking about the sort of core values really, and that I suppose that we are sort of trying to sort of get really across, and I touched on some of these, is that the importance of respecting the confidentiality of what children share. And this is really a big one for us, particularly at the moment. We're seeing like an increase in the numbers of family cases that are being diverted away from court, sort of mid proceedings. I don't know if there's any solicitors in the room, but we're certainly seeing a lot of that, and the direction is to go to child-inclusive mediation. And there's a tendency for there to be a misunderstanding about what child-inclusive mediation is. So I know there was some recent guidance published on forecourts on this specific subject in September, but there's sort of this misunderstanding that we will essentially obtain the views, wishes and feelings of children as part of the mediation process to give back to parents to then submit to the court in order for the court to make a decision, because of the busyness of CAFCAS and the sort of 6 to 28 week waiting list for a CAFCAS assessment. But that's sort of something that we don't do, and that's not the purpose. And so if someone approaches us because they have been directed by the court, what we do say is actually to remind them is that the confidentiality means that the child's views won't be able to be shared outside, and that they can't request a copy of anything in writing following any child-inclusive meetings. And that's the importance of respecting the rights of the child within that as well. And protecting the integrity of this process for children and young people, that parents can entrust and children can entrust, that this is about family-led decision-making rather than something else that informs the court for someone else to make a decision about what is in their best interest. So we fundamentally believe that parents are the best people to make decisions for their children. And that's one of the reasons that we do this work. Kathy, do you want to come in?
No, I think that's fine. Thank you. You covered that well.
Yeah, so sort of thinking about sort of like these sort of other points, the sort of sense of neutrality and creating that safe space. So as I said earlier, I met some children in a school this morning, which wouldn't be uncommon now. And we have a specialist room in our offices. In the Plymouth office, we have a special room, which is very child friendly and very child focused, with a number of distractions. But actually sort of the importance of creating that neutral safe space is critical. So in my experience, actually, where we've had children who have perhaps had the child-inclusive meeting online in a family home, it hasn't actually influenced the decisions in the way in which people feel that it could. But I think that for the sense that there could be a potential influence just by being in one parent's house, it may influence what they say. That the fact that there's a sense that that could exist is sort of enough for us to sort of think about ensuring the neutrality of the venue. That said, I've had a number of cases over the last few years where parents couldn't agree on a neutral location for the sim to take place. And, you know, the right thing to do in those circumstances, of course, is to ask the young person where they would feel most comfortable having that meeting and giving them the options upon which they choose. And that's the sort of line that I tend to take now. So if we're going to listen to the child as part of the process about what their wishes and feelings are, then we should be able to ask them in respect of where they would feel most comfortable meeting with a mediator and giving them the choices to be able to make informed decisions. So that's always a sensitive and treading very carefully. But you know, if we're not going to listen to where they want to be seen and where they'd feel most comfortable, then we probably shouldn't be seeing them at all. Is my take on it. So and I don't know if you want to pick up, Kathy, on that sort of advocacy point there and the sort of balancing the voice of parental decision making. You sort of touched on that earlier, just now, about, you know, children not making the decisions. Do you want to say a bit more about that?
Yes, and to go back about the locations, I think that that is part of it, of letting the children have some advocacy, that they, by choosing it, I think in person, there's always the lure of the chocolate biscuits. That always seems to make them want to come to the office rather than Zoom. But sometimes they're happy on their bed with their phone because it's where they feel comfortable. But I think to pick up on what you said, Mabel, about the concerns of the parents, children tend to be to take it incredibly seriously and sort of do checks outside the door and around the house to make sure that they are in a confidential space and nobody is listening, because I know that that is usually a concern of a parent. And the balancing of the children's views with parental decision making, it can be. I think that I'll pick this up towards the end because I've got some examples of how this has actually worked and helped and contributed, and it's probably better to do that in a cohesive point at the end.
Yep, no, that's good. Thank you for that. Okay, so we were going to pick up on some bits from children's feedback here, and I think, Kathy, you were going to give us some examples. Do you want to do the examples first? Would that be?
Yes, I can do. The children, that's one thing they nearly always say, is that they feel respected when they've been asked to be included. And I think there's a very big thing that parents are quite often resistant to child inclusive, and they will quite often say, well, we don't want the children included, they don't know anything about the divorce, so we don't think there's any benefit in speaking to them. And I remember the very first time this was the case, and I spoke to the two youngsters, and they said, oh yes, we know all about it. They only argue indoors because then they think nobody can hear them. And we just wish they'd hurry up and get divorced because then we know everybody will be much happier. And the parents fell off their chairs laughing because the children knew. But what was actually important, when the parents came back, they said it had opened a dialogue with the children, and they were now moving forward and with the separation as a family, which hadn't happened up to that point. But once they realised and acknowledged that their children understood what was happening, they could have a bit of input into the process. I think, yeah, that was quite an important point, I found. And there's other ways that parents often say, well, the children tell me everything. There's nothing they don't share with me. And it's quite helpful to have a few examples, because sometimes it's not necessarily directly linked to the parent separation or divorce. It could be something like one parent who was a swimming instructor and took her children swimming 5 times a week. And when I spoke to the boys, they loathed swimming. They wanted to stop swimming and play football, but they knew it would really upset their mother. And it did. But after a lot of tears, she did stop the swimming, enrolled them in football, and when they came back, they said the children were happier than they'd ever been. There was another lad who told his dad a year before he really liked Thai food, and that's all his dad had given him for a year. And his message was, please, can we have something other than Thai food? But he knew why his dad was giving it to him all the time, but didn't want to upset him. And it's stories like these, that if you can provide those to the parents, that it's not always a big thing about where they'll be living. And it's like you said about the 7-year-old this morning, there's other things that are important, and not eating Thai food was massively important. It's something the parents could do very easily. But what happens is you give a few examples and the parents' interest is piqued, and they think, well, I wonder if there is something they're not saying because they don't want to hurt me. Another quick example was a girl who become a teenager and was quite body conscious. But every time she went to her dad's, they always had takeaways because that's something she'd always had. And she didn't want that. So she didn't want to go to her dad's because she didn't want takeaways. She wanted to cook meals with him, but couldn't because there were never any ingredients. And it's things like that. It's things that are quite big for the children that the parents can fix very easily, but it's giving them this outlet. Now, of course, it's other times when it's much, much more important what they've got to say, but it's sort of not to diminish the importance of letting them have a voice and giving the parents something that they can fix quite easily and makes the children happy. I think I've gone off target there. Do you want to bring it back in, Mabel?
I was also responding to some of the questions on the chat as we go at the same time. But no, I think it's yeah, so I think that sort of follows on from the point I was talking about earlier about the sort of agenda, is that not to sort of have like a set idea as to what it is that you're looking for children to say. And I think it is fair to say that in some cases that there is a clear agenda. So for example, if I was doing one on a specific issue around school choices, secondary school choices, changes of schools, those sorts of things, then we may have a specific issue that, as well as we won't just sort of keep it to the narrow issue, but we may be specifically seeking to obtain information about their sort of wishes and feelings about a change of school. So we might, for example, one case I can think of where I did that was we're looking at the pros and cons of, each school and, what the boy thought about each of the schools. And he was able to sort of quite eloquently explain why he had a preference for one school over and above the other. And that actually was a case I was thinking about earlier when I said, he actually chose, because his parents did like to argue about most things. So they couldn't agree on a venue for him to be met. And he chose to have his meeting online at his mum's house. And the preference of school that he chose was the preference of his father. So the school that he wanted to go to was the school that he had indeed told his dad he wanted to go to. And he was able to kind of use the mediation opportunity to carefully explain, why he preferred that school over and above the other school. And it was all sensible stuff. Like, he is an outdoorsy boy and he likes, the sports, and the school that his preference had a lot more sort of sports and outdoors facilities and a lot more sort of playing fields, whereas the other school was, was kind of more sort of concrete based around, didn't offer the same sort of extent of sports and leisure. The science labs had really captured him. He was very academic, really interested in science, and the science labs, and they'd done some science experiments at the open day, which he was able to share, and that had really captured him. I think, that the open day had really influenced him. So, but he was able to sort of share those things with his parents, and I was going to say that actually helped his parents to be able to really focus on his needs. And think about, whether or not he was able to make a decision about which school he went to. Parents, of course, had argued about which primary school he went to, and he'd gone to the primary school of mum's choosing. And here they were some 5-6 years later arguing about which secondary school he went to. So actually this gave him that opportunity to share with him his rationale and his reasoning. And that then enabled them to make decisions and to be able to step outside of the court arena and to settle things back down, and for him to be able to, the uncertainty is also really important in a specific issue like that, where you've got this young person who doesn't know what school they're going to, because their parents are arguing about it, and the uncertainty that brought to him, the instability and the insecurity that meant for him. And it had been going on for months, because these court processes, they're not quick. It had been going on for months, and it was causing him to have some anxieties, and he was able to share through the process that what he was feeling and where he was feeling it. Because sometimes when we see children, they talk about sort of, they're not necessarily able to describe easily about feelings. So, this morning when this young person was saying to me, sometimes when I'm with my daddy, I just feel like I really miss my mummy. And I say, well, when you miss your mummy, can you tell me, where do you feel that? And she's like, she said, I feel it here. You know, I said, you know, do you feel it anywhere else in your body? And she said, it's in my tummy. It makes my tummy go funny, and I feel funny. She might not be able to say that she's feeling anxious, but you know, she's like, you know, she's describing these body feelings, and that to be able to share that with the parents so that they can actually see the impact of these worries and these things that are happening for them and around them, are having on them. So as to help their parents to make, hopefully, decisions that are child-centered, and help them to support their emotional and psychological well-being, because effectively that's what we're talking about. Does that make sense? Does that sort of make sense? So just sort of on the feedback point, then we wanted to sort of pick up on some work that we've been doing at Children First Mediation, in terms of feedback. So over the last few months, we were saying, well, you know, feedback from parents in family mediation is very scarce. It's very difficult to achieve. So we sort of thought, well, you know, why don't we ask children if we can get some feedback from them? And you know, it's a big ask, because we're asking children to come outside of their comfort zones and to sit in a meeting, be that face to face or online with a stranger, to talk about some really uncomfortable things. Yeah. So we've been inviting children and young people to give feedback over the last few months. And so I haven't looked the last couple of days, but on Friday we've had 29 feedback forms, which I think is quite remarkable, to have actually had 29 children who have actually responded to the questions that we've asked them. And it's been quite overwhelming that the numbers of children who've actually sort of been able to say to us that they feel that having been given the opportunity. So over 95% of the children were saying, yeah, I really valued the opportunity to meet with someone to talk about what I'm thinking and talk about what I'm feeling. And that's been something that they've really valued. And 95% were saying that they felt comfortable in that meeting. So even though they had a meeting with a stranger in quite strange circumstances to talk about some really difficult subjects, some really difficult things, they actually felt comfortable within the meeting, and they felt heard. They felt that they were heard, and 70% felt that their parents had heard them. And we were looking at the answers to those questions. We were saying, you know, the point at which we were asking them to respond is within sort of a couple of weeks of the mediation taking place, which of course might not be the best time to capture, you know, the success of the outcomes, if you like, but ultimately, you know, not wanting to sort of wanting to be able to get some kind of helpful feedback from children about their experiences within the process, if you like, rather than, you know, whether or not, you know, it's been life-changing or life impacting. So what we heard was that actually that 70% were feeling that their parents had actually heard what they had said. And it is true that not all parents are able to take on board, even with the careful preparation work that Kathy and I would do, for example, that unfortunately not all parents are then able to make use of what their children say. And that's a factor. And we see that increasingly where there's a direction from the court. And so some of the children that did give feedback were children who were effectively, in their views, one particular boy said, I didn't want to do it. Even though he knew it was voluntary, he didn't feel it was, because the court had directed them and his mum was saying, you have to do this. I didn't want to do it. I said I didn't want to do it, and, you know, therefore I don't feel heard, which was really difficult. And, you know, no, I still don't, it hasn't changed anything, because he didn't want it to change anything, because he doesn't want to have a relationship with his dad. So, and actually really positively, I think 60% of children were actually saying that things were better. You know, so within 2 weeks of mediation having taken place, they were saying, yeah, things are already starting to get better, which is really great news. And I think, you know, it's fair to say that in the first mediation appointments that we have before we consult with children, as mediators, we're often doing work with parents at that stage and supporting them to look at ways in which they might improve their communication, their cooperation with one another. and that actually for many parents, they are able to start to think about putting some of those actions in place and think about what might need to be different. So things might already have started between sort of session 1, us then seeing the children, and then that second feedback session where we feedback to parents and then go on to sort of help parents to formulate their own plans for their children's future. So yeah, I mean, overwhelmingly, children have actually fed back. They have found it to be a positive experience. And we're hoping to be able to get a bit of sort of support with looking at what sorts of questions might be more helpful to ask children at that stage, to be able to obtain as much feedback as we can. So thank you. So the value of listening to children. Kathy, do you want to say, oh, so I'll go back one, apologies. Do you want to sort of come in here?
Well, yes, I think there's a couple of points that you went over. One is that adults tend to make the assumption that children all want the same thing. And it was most clearly illustrated recently with 3 boys, young teenagers, and one wanted to spend 2 days alternating between their parents. One wanted a full week alternating. They thought it all through. The 2-day was in 6th form. He'd have a suit at both houses. The other one wanted 1 week alternating, swap over at his tennis lesson on Saturday. And the other one just wanted to live with mum and have fun days out with dad. And they thought really carefully about what they wanted and how it would work for them, how it would fit in with the whole family. It was really important that the parents were prepared in the pre-meeting to take on board what the children said, and they had these slightly complex arrangements, but it demonstrated that you can't really predict what anybody else would actually want, and that by listening to the children, and things like arrangements for Christmas Day, they usually have really strong opinions. They want to see both parents on Christmas Day, or they don't want to be watching the clock for when they have to leave one house and go to another. They can always articulate what it is they feel and explain why. It's just giving them the space to say it openly and without fear of upsetting either parent, because you can discuss with the child, okay, well, how do you want that fed back? What words would you like used? And you can sort of agree how it's going to be shared with the parents, which comes to one of the other questions, I think, in the chat about if there's something they don't want to share with the parent, you have to make sure it's not a safeguarding concern, but is there somebody they would share who, if it's depending on what it is and why, I can't think of an example off the top of my head, but to make sure that there is somebody that they would confide in, that's an appropriate person to deal with that issue if they don't think it's something their parents can. But I can't think of a circumstance where I've faced that. A message is nearly always for one parent more than the other. It has to be given equally to both at the same time, but the important thing is to try and balance it out. So if most of the messages are going to one parent, make sure there's something else that the children have thought that the other parent could pull their socks up on, and they've always got something. It was one boy who wanted his dad to learn to cook something else apart from fish. And again, it was quite a nice witty end to it, but there's always something that you can balance it off with that the other parent needs to do. And it doesn't matter if it's trivial, but quite often the messages are directed more at one person than another, but you don't need to hammer that home. The parents get it without you being too forceful in the the relaying of the message.
Absolutely. Yeah, that's very true. And I think there's a couple of comments in the chat there about both touching on parental alienation, or suggestions, we'll call it suggestions of parental alienation. My experience, actually, I do a lot of work with children, young people who are saying they don't want to see one parent or the other. You know, in the work we do, most often people say, oh, you know, she's alienating them or he's alienating them, but the presentation of the child is rarely alienation, you know, because actually when we talk to children and young people, what we're talking to them about, you know, what's gone wrong and what might need to happen to make things right, and what's the first thing that would be different, what's the first thing that might change. And, you know, tell me about a time when you last saw dad, you know, what did you enjoy doing, what things did you like to do? And actually children are very spontaneous in those scenarios, and they can talk about positive experiences with both parents in different scenarios. But when we often see these young people that, you know, they're feeling upset, they're feeling let down, they're feeling like they're not being heard, they're feeling like dad's left us, is a good example. Dad's left us rather than having kind of, you know, left the marriage or the relationship with mum. The sense of being abandoned, the sense of being left behind. Often, you know, new partners, new relationships, new children in those family households, you know, where children are wanting their dads to claim them, to have that one-to-one quality time with them, and, you know, dads are insisting in the introduction of new partners and new partners' children and overnight stays with this, that and the other. And actually children they're only so resilient, you can only pull them so far before they snap. And, you know, so I often talk to parents in mediation about sort of being two sides of a drawbridge, and that you each bring essentially stability and security to your child. And, you know, if for the two sides of the drawbridge, for your child to be able to safely, physically and emotionally make the journey from one side to the other, the drawbridge needs to sort of meet sort of roughly in the middle, you know, somewhere safe for them to cross. But actually, it doesn't matter what side that drawbridge is up. It doesn't matter whether it's mum's side or dad's side. The divide gets bigger. The more animosity, the more hostility, the more anger, the more history that goes before, the further that bridge goes up. So if it goes up on one side, it still makes the journey really difficult for the child physically, emotionally, for them to be able to cross from mum's side to dad's side, from dad's side to mum's side, you know. And trying to really encourage parents really to reflect on that and to think about their child's needs within that, and how we can, you know, the start of all of my mediation sessions, we always start with the child at the center, and we always reflect and encourage them to reflect on their child's needs and their best hope for the child's future. So when I meet with children in those situations who are saying, you know, I don't want to see my dad anymore, I don't want to see my mum anymore, sometimes those children haven't seen them for years, but actually it's about saying, well, what might need to happen, what might be the first step. And actually, if you listen really carefully to what they say, you know, they say that they're hurting, and they're fed up with, you know, going back and trying to sort it out and then hurting some more, and feeling that, you know, they don't care, they don't love me enough. And if he did, then he would prove it to me. And, you know, but she don't want to speak to him, but she, you know, all this teenage stuff where you got this sort of pushing against boundaries, you know, you don't want your parents, but you do want your parents. The more you try to get them to do something, the less they're likely to do it. And actually is that, I remember taking a couple of girls, twins they were, on the beach for a walk, and they said to me, but he's our dad, he should still have contacted us. And I said, you know, girls, you know, I heard that you said to dad you didn't want him to message you anymore. I heard you said you didn't want him to text you and you didn't want him to come over to see you. Yeah, we did say that, but he's still our dad. He's the grown-up. He should know better. And I said, well, you know, what is it you want from him? We want to know that he loves us. We want to know that he cares for us. You know, he's always trying to get us to, you know, go to his house. It's always on his terms. But what about what we want? What about what we want? We want to see him on our terms. We don't want just to go to his new house with his new girlfriend and his new girlfriend's children. He's spending all that time over there with them. We're his children. He needs to spend time with us. He needs to show us that he wants to be our dad, you know, and they're wanting to make him work for it. And, you know, and often wanting apologies. you know, and some struggles that we have with mums and dads about giving apologies, you know, when they're asking, you know, for an apology, whether that's in writing or by text message, or they want to have something I facilitate is that intergenerational option that I will sit down with mum and the young person, or dad and the young person, and offer that opportunity for them to have these conversations and to have a restorative conversation to say, okay, what needs to happen to make things right, and to, by the end of that session, to have built a plan towards, you know, some kind of relationship rebuilding between the child and the parent. So I think that often behind those allegations of alienation is a long history of conflict between parents, poor communication and cooperation, very often no communication between parents. And, you know, when we see that bridge, no communication, you know, it's only a matter of time before children just go, you know what, it's just easy not to cross the bridge. And if they haven't already stopped crossing, when we see them, we can see those cases when they're heading in that direction. You know, parents are saying, well, I don't need to communicate with her anymore. I mean, she's 10 now. We can sort out the arrangements between us. She's 10. She's got her own phone. You know, I don't need to speak to her mother, do I? We're saying, you know, let's see what your child feels about that when they're caught in the middle and they're the messenger in those situations. So
Yeah, I think the drawbridge is a good analogy for that. And I think that whilst I'm not dismissing parental alienation or justified resistance as a thing, but I think quite often it's more like something being put into Google Translate and coming out with the unintended consequences, really, that it's often one parent is having to relay to the other parent the message, the children don't want to see you. But actually, it needs to be fleshed out a bit more than that. There were some children recently who didn't want to stay with their dad on school nights. And when I spoke to them, there were 4 of them, and the youngest one got car sick on the way to school, and it was a 40-minute drive from her dad's house, and she didn't like starting school feeling sick. So the 4 of them had sort of put up a united front. We won't go to dad's on school night. Once they understood the reason why the children said this, and that it wasn't the mum being deliberately awkward and putting her foot down, there was something that could be done. They could work with it. And I think something else that Mabel touched on there, but it's giving the parents a chance to see things from their child's perspective. And new parents are new partners, and particularly new partners' children, and more especially if they're living with their parent. And they often say that they feel like they're hotel guests when they go to stay with their parent. They find it difficult to cope with other children calling their dad dad, and they feel quite possessive about having to share that parent. They share their time with that parent. They want a bit of one-on-one time. That quite often there'll be different rules. The children that live in the house all the time are allowed to help themselves from the fridge, but they're not, and they don't understand the difference in the rules, why their crafts are left outside in the garden but the other children's are brought indoors. It's little things that once a parent sees it, and these are relayed with the children's own words, so I don't put a Kathy Francis spin on things when I relay it. I use the child's own words, and I think that's where they suddenly start to see how their child is feeling. When the 14-year-old is sent upstairs to play with the new girlfriends 4 and 5 years old, and she feels she's old enough to be downstairs with the adults, and that caused resentment, and therefore she misbehaved. And the dad didn't want her back in the house, but it was sort of like unpicking it and seeing, well, why? So it's very easy to look at it as parental alienation, but I think that sometimes that's quite an easy label, and that sometimes it is justified resistance rather than alienation by one parent.
yeah, it's arising out of the conflict between the adults, because I saw somebody put in the chat somewhere is that this conversation assumes that both parents have put their differences aside and have prioritized what is best for the children. And I think that's definitely a misunderstanding, because actually I think, Kathy, you and I would say absolutely not. I mean, it'd be very rare for us to actually be in a situation where both parents have put their differences aside and have prioritized what's best for their children. Actually, for the most part, the vast majority of people we see are not in that situation. When we see them at session 1, they're absolutely nowhere near that. They're poles apart. And actually, for the most part, the drawbridge is up. You know, and actually children are struggling with the emotional and physical journey between one home and the other. And actually, essentially, a part of our role is about helping them to have more difficult conversations, and the value of listening to children and the impact that that can have on the parents. And, you know, I've literally been in sessions where I'll share their children's views, and you know, their parents will be sat there and they'll be like, we've got to stop this. We have got to stop this. This is our fault. We've done this to her. We've made her feel this way. We have to stop doing this. Like, and then say, okay, you've got some choices. You've got some choices. You can carry on doing what you're doing right now, which isn't working for either of you, and it isn't working for your children from what I've heard, or you can choose to do something different. You know, so if we then refocus them on what are the options about what are we going to do differently moving forward, you know, in terms of their communication and their cooperation is pivotal to everything that comes next. So for me as a mediator, it is about the communication and the cooperation between the adults, because if that isn't working well, then nothing else works. If we can help them to improve that area, then things improve around the time that the children spend with each of them. So I think that it's definitely not based on that assumption at all. But for the most part, people aren't in good places when we see them. And actually they are, you know, I want 50-50. And I hear that you want 50-50, but, you know, what does, you know, it's not a spreadsheet. What do your children need? You know, what's realistic? You know, what's going to meet their emotional needs, their psychological needs, their educational needs? You know, what's your best hope for their future? And how far away from achieving that are you? You know, where you haven't seen your child. Saw a dad hadn't seen his child for sort of since the summer holidays, since before the summer holidays, because she expressed wanting to stay with mum for an extra week in the summer holidays, outside of mediation, of course, but with a court order that says that this is what should happen. And, you know, dad's still pushing on about what he wants in a court order, which then means he hasn't seen her for, you know, he hasn't seen her for 7 months. And, you know, when we speak to her, she says, you know, well, what needs to happen? I want to take it slowly. He needs to listen to me. I want it to go at my pace. I definitely don't want to go on Friday nights anymore, because it was really stressful. And he was always tired. It was really tired from work. It was really stressful for me. He used to shout a lot and I didn't like it. But on Saturdays, it was much calmer and we had a lovely weekend. And I really want to see my dad. I really enjoy seeing my dad. And I say, like, you know, you haven't seen him for 7 months, you know, what might be the first step in that journey to reconnecting with your dad? Well, I want to, you know, start seeing him for a few hours, but he needs to, you know, respect me, and he needs to show me. And how will you know if he's respecting you? But actually what happened in that situation is that, unfortunately, dad still wants what's in his court order. So even though the child's expressed, you know, not wanting to do the Friday night, she's only looking to drop the Friday nights, is that he is persistent on wanting what was in his court order, even though the court have directed the mediation, and he's not listening to what the child is saying. And so what is inevitable is that it's likely to be that the contact that has been re-established now since just before Christmas is likely to break down again. And she'll probably not go for a considerable period of time, if at all, because she doesn't feel he's valuing her opinion. She doesn't feel like he's respecting her, and he's not listening. And she's not feeling comfortable about the Friday nights. And if he can't listen to that, then she just will choose not to see him at all. And, you know, sometimes we try to sort of have this sort of difficult conversations sort of with parents about, you know, it could be the difference between, you know, dropping a Friday night and, you know, seeing her Saturdays and Sundays for the foreseeable, or just not seeing her at all, you know. But pushing for the Fridays might mean you don't see her at all, or writing that letter of apology, or sending her that text, or having that conversation and apologizing for your part in this situation may be the difference between you reconnecting with her or not reconnecting with her. I'm not writing her a letter, well, you know, well, that might mean that you don't see her again, you know. So, you know, listening to what she's saying, you know, how are you going to broker? And sometimes parents don't feel like they should have to broker with their children. You know, there's this sort of dynamic where, you know, I'm the parent, I'm the authoritarian. But I think with the sort of child inclusive mediation sort of remit is about sort of a more modern way of thinking, that children do have a right to be heard. They do have a right to express their wishes and feelings. And it's not for children and young people to always have what they want, but it's about the parents then sort of taking that on board and balancing that with what essentially is in the child's best interests. And as mediators, I can see there's a number of comments and things on the chat about it, but as mediators, we are not the decision makers in this. We're not deciding what happens. You know, ultimately, you know, whether or not someone has a narcissistic ex-partner, or whether or not it's not for us to judge whether someone is or isn't narcissistic, or whether someone has or hasn't experienced domestic violence or domestic abuse. As part of our screening process, when people enter mediation, we will carefully consider whether or not it's suitable or not suitable. And it wouldn't be probably a surprise to you to hear that sometimes we have people who we would identify as having been victims of domestic abuse, who perhaps don't identify as victims of domestic abuse, but actually where we're saying it's not suitable, and they're pleading with us to offer them the opportunity. And so we have a sort of dilemma around their sort of rights to choose and their right to self-determine, their ability to participate in the process, over and above our decision to refuse them that right. But actually, if a person with the ability to choose, an adult with the ability to choose to participate in the process, chooses to participate, then we would see that it's they have the ability within themselves to be able to make the decisions as to whether or not it's in their child's best interest to have contact with dad or not, or whether they're you know, we would assume that they weren't going to be manipulated within that process, because that's part of our screening. So it wouldn't be for us to sort of judge whether or not dad's sort of narcissism was going to lead to a particular outcome, because in those types of cases, the likelihood is that those people wouldn't have entered into the mediation process or arena in the first place. It's part of an exemption that people can apply for, and so we wouldn't likely see the majority of those parents.
I think that you do have to take each case on its merits. And there was one case I had where the children had been taken away from their mother and moved to their dad, and the mother was pushing for to go to court to have access, and the children wanted to come to mediation and explain why they didn't want to see their mother. And it obviously the mother was really upset, but she was an alcoholic, so she didn't remember any of the things she did, like feeding them dog biscuits for breakfast or locking them in a van if they were naughty, and they had to pick up dog poo as a punishment. But they ran a kennels and a breeding kennels, and they had over 48 dogs. So and they could explain it, and they could say living with dad is heaven. We don't want to even see mum anymore. And they didn't even call her mum, actually. It was hard, but the mum then stopped the court action, and they've been going through court for years and years and years. And just sort of having that with the children and the hope that perhaps things might change in future. But it's taking each case on its merits, and it always has there's always something positive comes back. That it's just making sure that the adults are listening.
Yeah, that's very true. So yeah, so there are still quite a lot of questions on the chat. There are so many, but we'll try and get all of those answered and see if we can get those sent across to all people that are still with us. There's still 137 people with us, Kathy. So just
Are they awake though?
Yeah, so we have 140. Yeah, we topped at 149, which I think was quite impressive this afternoon. But
Okay.
sort of looking at the impact, really, I mean, it really does, and certainly in the work that I do, and I know that the work that Kathy does, you know, it certainly does improve the relationship between parents and children, and it really does move along these stuck situations where children aren't seeing one parent or the other. The quicker we can get in there, the better to be able to support and move those things along. And it really does help parents to make more informed and balanced decisions around what's in their children's best interest, as opposed to, you know, giving children everything they want. And it actually goes on to really help to reduce those communication difficulties and the conflict between parents. Parents really are forced to sit up and listen. And smell the roses, they might say in other setups, so to speak. You know, sometimes it comes with a punch, doesn't it, Kathy? You know, it's like, whoa, you know, blimey, we actually need to stop. We need to do something different. Do our children really feel this? Is this really what's happening? And the great thing is that for the majority, we don't really know anything about these families, and that when we do our icebreaker work with the children and young people who are there, it's always very evident and clear that we learn so much about the children. We bring a sense of those children into the space, so parents can really get a feel for, you know, they know that their children have shared those views. So yeah, no, and I think it does help children to give them permission that, you know, it's okay to speak about these things. And sometimes for many children, it is the first time they've had that opportunity just to speak about how they're feeling, that someone's actually taken the time to listen. So yeah, really important opportunity. But yeah, it's been really fantastic talking about child-inclusive mediation this afternoon
I think we could probably go on for another couple of hours.
About a good few hours, Kathy, I'm sure.
Yes, we're just warming up, aren't we?
Yeah, we absolutely are. We've still got 122 people there, but we'll try and do our very best to try and get through answers to most of those questions if we can, and we'll make sure that the slides are made available to everyone that's come. So you know, really grateful for the interest this afternoon in coming and finding out so much more about it.